Notes on the Bhagavad Gita by William Q. Judge, chapters 15 and 16. Quote, men say that Ashvatha, the eternal sacred tree, grows with its roots above and its branches below, the leaves of which are the Vedas, and he who knows this knows the Vedas. End quote. In these words, Krishna presents a symbol used by men to indicate the universe as an eternal evolutionary stream, proceeding from a changeless source. This source, through changelessness itself, produces change in ever-increasing differentiations throughout the great period of manifestation. When the limit of differentiation is reached, the same impulse gradually indraws all differentiations toward homogeneity. This evolutionary process is graphically symbolized in the secret doctrine as the great breath, with its periodical out-breathing and in-breathing. Neither the quote out-breathing or in-breathing, end quote, nor both together, describe or constitute the great breath, for these are actions by that which has the power to so act. And, as Krishna states in this chapter, quote, it is the primeval spirit from which floweth the never-ending stream of conditioned existence, end quote. Quote, the leaves of which are the Vedas, end quote, refers specifically to the sacred scripture of that time. At the same time, it should also be understood as applicable to sacred scriptures of all times, for these are but formulations by men of portions of the eternal verities, formulations which present in concrete form such spiritual, philosophical, and ethical ideals as exist among men at the time of formulation. These formulations are here properly symbolized by, quote, leaves, end quote, for they shoot forth from the branches, or the three qualities, and have their period of manifestation, and are replaced by other, quote, leaves, end quote. Quote, its form is not thus understood by men. It has no beginning, nor can its present constitution be understood, nor has it any end. End quote. This sentence may be comprehended better if read in connection with the second paragraph of the chapter, which says, quote, it is even a portion of myself which, having assumed life in this world of conditioned existence, draweth together the five senses and the mind in order that it may obtain a body, and may then leave it again. This power to draw together and to disperse is that of the Supreme Spirit. It is the Self, the real man, quote, a portion of myself, end quote, in every human form, as well as in all forms. It is not thus understood by men who are bound by ahankara, which is the self-identifying tendency of the 13th chapter. But it may be realized by, quote, those who are free from pride of self and whose discrimination is perfected, who have prevailed over the fault of attachment to action, who are constantly employed in devotion to meditation upon the Supreme Spirit, who have renounced desire and are free from the influence of the opposites known as pleasure and pain, end quote. Knowledge of the Supreme Spirit comes from identification with it. Realization comes from dwelling upon the things to be realized. The, quote, power to perceive, end quote, is the very essence of our being. Our perceptions are not that power, they are the exercise of it. our perceptions are the basis of our actions. It is because we identify ourselves with our perceptions that we are deluded and bound by the actions that flow from them. Quote, "There are two kinds of beings in the world, the one divisible, the other indivisible. The divisible is all things and all creatures." End quote. That is, all forms and objects of every kind, since every form and object is composed of minor forms or expressions of life or consciousness. Our bodies, for instance, are composed of mineral, vegetable, and animal lives and substance. These are borrowed from the three kingdoms below us and are returned to them. Hence the term, quote, divisible, end quote. Quote, "The indivisible is called christos, or he who standeth on high, unaffected," end quote. Residing in every composite form and all forms that are, there is a synthetic consciousness which has evolved and sustains that form. That synthetic power is unaffected by any changes in the form. In man, christos would seem to indicate the divine ego, whose divinity and spiritual nature remain as such through all forms and changes. Quote, "But there is another spirit designated as the Supreme Spirit, Paramatma, which permeates and sustains the three worlds. As I am above the divisible and superior to the indivisible, therefore, both in the world and in the Vedas, am I known as Supreme Spirit. He who is being not deluded knoweth me thus as the Supreme Spirit, knoweth all things, and worships me under every form and under every condition." Devotion through knowledge of the Supreme Spirit begins with the recognition that there is but one Spirit, the source and sustainer of everything that exists. As the Upanishads say, quote, "The self shines in all, but in all it does not shine forth," end quote. The self is in all things, and all things are in the self. Whatever there may be of, quote, shining, end quote, through any form or any condition, that, quote, shining, end quote, is from and of the self. If this is then recognized and admitted, we must begin to regard all things and all beings in that light and act toward them upon that basis. In this way, we act for and as the self. And as we hold to and follow that practice, all ideas, habits, and desires that conflict become overcome little by little, until at last we have the supreme power for good that comes with selflessness. Give love, be selfless. In this chapter, Krishna begins with an enumeration of, quote, godlike, end quote, qualities. It will be noted that these qualities or virtues are not so numerous as they are comprehensive and complementary, and that taken as a whole, they fully express the title under which they are assembled, i.e., a godlike nature. When we come to examine these qualities from the modern point of view and compare with one another, we may find it difficult to reconcile some with the others, as for instance, quote, power and fearlessness with freedom from conceit, end quote. Our individualistic tendencies incline us to think that a sense of superiority is necessarily present with power in the absence of fear. Again, if we take the simplest, most definite, and most easily understood of these qualities, quote, not speaking of the faults of others, end quote, we see only a pale and negative virtue. Yet, fault-finding is the most universal and the most insidious expression of conceit and self-assertion. Speaking of and pointing out the faults of others is a vice which masquerades under many forms of virtue, but in reality it is used to hide our own faults and present the appearance of a righteousness that we do not possess. A vice which permeates self-delusion and negatives every apparent virtue. The biblical St. Paul, the initiate, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, says in this regard, quote, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass and tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and do understand all mysteries, and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing." End quote. Here, charity implies the possession of all of those virtues, for they are all included in it. It implies the absence of fault-finding and condemnation. But charity is not negative. That which makes charity effective is knowledge, not sentiment or intent. Hence, the need of discriminating between here what are called, quote, godlike and demonical, end quote, natures. We must therefore inquire into the meaning of discrimination. It is a faculty or a power whose range and value depend entirely upon the knowledge and understanding of the specific individual using it. All men use this faculty, but in as many different degrees as exist between the densest ignorance and the highest intelligence and wisdom. It may be called the ability to do the right thing at the right time and in the right place on every plane of action. This necessitates a universal point of view, an understanding that covers the whole of nature, and a universal application of both. In the ancient wisdom of the Gita, begins with universals and descends into particulars. This is being the course of evolution. It possessed one spirit as animating all beings and all forms, and shows the universe to consist as an aggregation of evolved beings in innumerable grades, each with its own form and its own tendency, and each acting according to its own acquired nature. Whatever accords with the acquired nature of each being will appear to it as good. Whatever obstructs or opposes it will appear to it as evil. This being true, it is self-evident that good and evil are not things within themselves, but are appearances due to the perceiver towards the things, the forms, the conditions, and circumstances. No such considerations as the above could be addressed to any being that is lower than man, because he alone, of all those in physical forms, has reached the point of development of his acquired nature, which enables him to grasp that which is above as well as that which is below, and permits him to extend his range of perceptions to all directions. He has reached that point at which he can know himself to be immortal, and may, if he wills, bring his acquired nature in accord with his own spiritual nature. All of his perceptions are of the, quote, pairs of opposites, end quote. Without these he could never find himself, nor understand the natures of those who are struggling to be free themselves from the binding force with forms and conditions. Thus it must be understood that man, the eternal pilgrim, is not his perceptions, for they are always relative, and all perceptions are to be found, quote, the pairs of opposites, end quote, for no perception could exist without them. Without the darkness, there could be no perception of light. Without pain, there could be no perception of pleasure. And without sorrow, there could be no acception of joy. Without sin, there could be no perception of holiness. That these perceptions are all relative to the perceiver is shown in the fact that what is light to some is darkness to others. That which is pleasure to some is pain to others, and that which is joy to some is sorrow to others. That which is holiness to some, a mortal sin to others. It is the lack of understanding of these facts in nature that produces every kind of, quote, demonical nature, end quote. And there are many kinds. And there are those who, quote, know not the nature of action, nor of cessation from action, end quote. Those who, quote, deny that the universe, or this realm, has any truth in it, saying, it is not governed by divine law, declaring that it hath no divine spirit or truth in it. And there are those who, quote, seek by injustice an accumulation of wealth for their gratification of their own lusts and appetites, end quote. There are those who esteem, quote, themselves very highly, self-willed, full of pride, ever in pursuit of riches. Reader's note, notoriety and fame included, end reader's note. What an arraignment this is of present-day religions and systems of thought! All sects present formulas which must be accepted on faith, but which cannot be proved to be true. Many systems of thought affirm the unproven and unprovable, and on the facts of experience, thus ignoring divine law and justice in the universe. They deny the effects they perceive on one side of nature, and affirm as self-existence the effects they perceive of another or opposite kind. They delude themselves by offsetting one effect against the other, and never perceiving the cause of both said effects. None of these religions and systems of thought, as represented by their adherents, have the faintest suspicion that they are but repetitions of the errors of the past times and peoples. Yet such is the fact known to every student of ancient literatures, religions, and sciences, who has gained discrimination by means of the, quote, pairs of opposites, end quote. As before said, true discrimination proceeds from a universal point of view and understanding the, quote, whole nature and universal application of both, end quote. The universal point of view is that all manifested nature, including all things below man, man himself, and all beings above man, as well as all forms, degrees of substance, and elements, have proceeded from one source and one divine spirit. The understanding comes from a realization that from the atom to the highest being, each is an expression of that one divine spirit, and that form the faintest glimmering of perception in the lowest kingdom to the heights of divine knowledge. The path is the same for all under divine law. Then comes the application of the knowledge gained. The student must raise himself beyond, quote, the influence of the pairs of opposites, end quote. He must see that these are but the means and modes necessary to give him ever-widening perception. and he must realize that he is the perceiver, and not nor any of his perceptions. And as he raises himself above the influence, he will find others like himself, and still others beyond, who are of God-like nature. He who possesses that which appear to others as virtues, but which to them are but actions with spiritual knowledge as the director, who understands the vices of men to be due to ignorance and not to innate wickedness, and who hence have patience, power, and fortitude, universal compassion, modesty, and mildness, and not that the relatives of good and evil can or ever should be destroyed, but that the spiritual identity of all beings shall be realized at every stage, and only such thought and action prevail as will bring out a harmonious progress towards perfection. True discrimination distinguishes between good and evil and mixed natures. It knows that all human beings are inherently perfectible, and that the imperfections exist only in the lower acquired nature. That while this acquired nature exhibits itself in actions, its root lies in tendencies fostered by limited and erroneous conceptions. The effort is therefore not expended in classifications of comparative good and evil, nor is there any condemnation of any being because of the state in which he is found to be. The causes that have led up to each state are shown, the right basis for thought and action is given, the landmarks upon the, quote, small old path, end quote, that leads far beyond comparative good and evil are pointed out, and the pilgrim patiently helped on every step of the way. End of chapters 15 through 16. The notes on the Bhagavad Gita by William Q. Judge. Love yourselves and love each other unconditionally.